serve practice. I thought it was wrong the first time. So good afternoon. Can everybody hear me? Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm tremendously excited to have today's guest. Peter Bergen has been associated with the center in one way or another in its old incarnation and its new incarnation here at Fordham since the very beginning. Hard to keep up with him, but we try by just bringing him in as much as we can to tell us what's going on in our world of national security, terrorism, counterterrorism, and domestic policy related to these things. So, just to be nice to us, he wrote another book so that we could bring him in to talk about this. Peter is, I don't have to tell you, he's a correspondent on CNN. He is a professor, you probably don't know this, at the University of Arizona as a professor of practice. He's a fellow at the Center on National Security here at Fordham, and for much of his day job, he is vice president of the New America Foundation and runs their national security program. And he is in the middle of a whirlwind book tour, so I'm happy to have grabbed him to talk about this. Now, today we're going to be talking about his book, The United States of Jihad, which is a somewhat scary title. So we're going to start a little bit by talking about the title. And I just want to ask you, Peter, the title suggests United States of Jihad as if it sounds a little, fearful. And so just can you clarify the difference between the actual conclusions of the book and the title?
Well, first of all, thanks everybody for coming, and thanks to you, Karen, and it's wonderful to be here at Fordham in this beautiful building, and thanks to Tom Durkin, who was here, who gave me a lot of his time, represented the three Khan siblings who attempted to join ISIS but were arrested at an airport, and that's the story I begin the book with. And, United States of Jihad, I mean, we can have a discussion about book titles very briefly. There are book titles that suck, and there are book titles that are great. I mean, I'll give you an example of one of the world's greatest book titles, Fiasco by Tom Ricks, which was about our invasion of Iraq. I mean, in one word, he basically tells you what the book is going to be about. And so, United States of Jihad, I think, gets at a few different ideas once you start thinking about it. I mean, it kind of gets at the idea that we have in some ways, kind of convinced ourselves that this is kind of an existential problem and really a great threat to the United States, when it is a problem and it's persistent, and but it's a low-level problem that we've really managed and contained, partly because of the work of people in this room like Frank Pellegrino and John Antisev and many others. And it also gets at the kind of the big question in the book, and I can't claim to have answered it even after 2.5 years, is why would an American citizen, a decade and a half after 9/11, join a group like ISIS, or attempt to join a group like ISIS, or adopt ISIS's ideology or al-Qaeda's ideology? After all, on some levels, it's a form of treason. These groups, are dedicated to killing Americans. I look at a lot of cases and try and unpack, to use a horrible verb, but we are in an academic environment, so I am allowed to use it, right? Unpack. Try and, what goes into these decisions? Why does an American citizen adopt jihadi ideology even many years after 9/11? And that's the subject of the book.
So let me just push you a little bit on that. A lot of people call us and say, can you help us think about the difference between al-Qaeda in the United States, al-Qaeda, counterterrorism and al-Qaeda, and how we understood the threat from 9/11 until 2014, and this new group of 80 ISIS cases? How are they the same? How are they different? So that I can answer this question intelligently going forward.
Well,
how would you do?
I mean, the subtitle of the book is Investigating America's Homegrown Terrorists, and if you think about it, in a sense, there's a good news and a bad news story here. I mean, this is a very American phenomenon. I looked at it like the center here. I collect cases of jihadi terrorism, and we have a database of more than 300 cases of jihadi terrorism crimes. Some of them minor, some of them major. that have happened in this country, and 4 out of the 5 of people accused or convicted are American citizens or residents. So this is, as Anwar al-Awlaki said at one point, this is, jihad is as American as apple pie. That seems like an absurd idea, but the fact is that jihad is, in some ways, has sort of become Americanized on some levels in a way that maybe a little unexpected. So what's the difference? I mean, the big difference is we're sitting in the city that was attacked, on Tuesday morning, September 11th, almost 3,000 Americans died at the hands of 19 men who, it was a huge conspiracy. They had hundreds of thousands of dollars. They planned it. KSM visited bin Laden to give the first idea in 1996 to bin Laden. That is not going to happen again in this country. The likelihood of an attack of that scale, I think, is close to zero. The likelihood of an attack, even a Paris-style attack, look at what happened in Paris. It was 7 guys who committed suicide. They'd all been trained in Syria. There were probably 2 dozen other conspirators. They plugged into a huge relatively large support network in Belgium and France. We're just not going to see that. I mean, the difference is these 80 cases. I mean, these are, largely people radicalizing in their bedrooms or radicalizing in their basements, with no connection to any foreign terrorist organization except aspirational and sort of ideological fellow travelers. Very few of them have got to Syria. The ones that got to Syria are dead. I mean, Nicole Mansfield from Flint, Michigan, dead. Douglas MacArthur McCain, born in Minnesota, raised in California, dead. There are only 2 people who have come back from Syria to the United States who've been trained. One of them was Abu Mona Salah, who then went back to Syria and conducted a suicide operation. He was from Florida. And the other case is somebody who's now convicted for some kind of plot to attack a military base in Texas. So 2 cases. Now, I presume there may be others we don't know about. Let's even make that presumption. But we're looking at hundreds, or Director of National Intelligence Jim Clapper testified in the last 48 hours that the number of Western foreign fighters is now 6,900. Now, the last time we had official count was 4,500, and that was just several months ago. So we're protected by our geography. You can drive from Paris to Damascus. You can't drive from Damascus to New York. And we're protected by the fact that we're just not getting the volume of recruits. So I think the cases, I mean, that I think the FBI has this pretty under control. I mean, sometimes they're going to miss something. San Bernardino, obviously. I mean, until we have a machine that can read people's souls and minds, the San Bernardino type attack is going to happen again because they didn't have a criminal record. They were pretty careful about what they said on social media.
One of the things that the book does very well, among many things that it does very well, is to pick out individual cases and talk about the evolution to terrorism, both from before the ISIS days and currently. Could you pick 1 or 2 cases and talk about the ones that most interested you in terms of a compelling emotional narrative?
As a journalist, you're a prisoner of your sources in a sense. If somebody doesn't want to talk to you and their family doesn't want to talk to you, I mean, it's hard to report. So I pick cases where either they were emblematic of something big, or I had a fair amount of access to the families or even the perpetrator. And I'll give you an example of where I got a 100-page letter from Zachary Chesser, who's now in Supermax in Florence, Colorado. And he is utterly unrepentant. I mean, if you may recall the South Park episode where this group Revolution Muslim was basically inciting violence against Matthew Stone and Trey Parker, the creators of South Park. We have a First Amendment in this country. Inciting racial hatred is the reason why the UK Parliament had a debate about whether you should let Donald Trump in or not. Inciting racial hatred is a crime in the United Kingdom. They didn't let Pamela Geller in on that basis. The dean of the Islamophobia industry. Denying the Holocaust for obvious reasons is a crime in Germany. And so none of these crimes exist here. I mean, we can say whatever we want with one big exception. If you incite violence against somebody to a group of people who may well carry out your intentions, that is a pretty serious crime. And Neil McBride who is well known to Karen, who was the prosecutor in the Eastern District of Virginia, who he had a brilliant observation that he quoted Karl Popper in the sentencing statement against one of the people in Revolution Muslim who was associated with Zachary Chesser, which is, essentially, to create a tolerant society, we have to be intolerant of the intolerant, and to create so we can't. There is a kind of limits to what we can tolerate to have a free society. And Zachary Chesser, he was certainly inciting violence against Trey Stone, the creators of South Park. And, his journey, he converted to Islam. He's a very bright kid. He has an IQ of 148. He was a Civil War buff when he was 9. His parents, his mother is a prosecutor in the District of Columbia, really a law and order person. And she talked to me at some length. And his father works is an economist. So this is like a very upper middle class family from suburban Washington, and he adopts this revolutionary ideology. And why he did it, I think, from the letter and from other things that he said, for him it was tremendously exciting to be part of the jihad. He reveled in the, quote, I'm quoting him directly now, enormous influence that he was wielding on the internet. He was really one of the very first jihadis to write in English. And of course, this is part of the Americanization of jihad. I mean, the internet was created in the United States, so perhaps it's fitting that it was Americans, Samir Khan, who edited Inspire magazine, Anwar al-Awlaki, who was born in New Mexico, Zachary Chesser, who really created an English-speaking movement of jihad, because before it was all in Arabic. A lot of the stuff was in Arabic, and it was password-protected forums. And so these were sort of the pioneers. So in Zachary Chesser's case, I think suddenly, Jarrett Brackman, who's a counterterrorism expert at North Dakota, was in touch with him. He's 21, treating him really seriously. And for him, yes, there was ideology, but also it was like, wow, now people are really paying a lot of attention to me. And that's pretty powerful when you're that age.
Anybody else you want to talk about besides Carlos?
Well,
Bledsoe,
Karen and I have had this conversation before, so I apologize to her if I repeat something, but I'm going to repeat this one.
Right.
I think there's, Immanuel Kant, the philosopher, said something which I think is very true if you're a journalist or an historian or writing about human beings, which is, or trying to understand human beings, from the crooked timber of humanity, not a straight thing is made. And I think that's a very profound observation, because we want to categorize it. We have to categorize things because otherwise the world's too confusing. But the human beings don't really fit into neat categories. And once you start really looking at these cases, let's say you look at Major Nidal Hasan. On the face of it, he's an Islamic fundamentalist who killed American soldiers, and that's all true. But when at Fort Hood, Texas, he killed 12 soldiers and 1 civilian. One of the characters in the book, interestingly, is Kerry Cahill, who's the daughter of Michael Cahill, who was the civilian who was killed. And I'll get to her in a second. But Nidal Hasan, who grew up with Nidal Hasan, they're double first cousins, so they're genetically like brothers. Their sisters married brothers. They're both born in Virginia. Nidal Hasan is a successful attorney and criminal defense lawyer, interestingly, in Northern Virginia. Major Nidal Hasan became an army major, a psychiatrist, and then a mass murderer. Now, Nader, who is a secular Muslim, and interestingly says, the organizations that claim to speak for Muslim Americans are uniformly Islamic in nature. And he's a guy with a beer in a fridge. I mean, he's still Muslim, but he feels that his voice isn't really being heard. But his account of Major Nidal Hasan was he was unmarried, about to turn 40. He probably never had a physical relationship with anybody. He was a virgin. He was deeply fearful of deploying to Afghanistan. His parents had died relatively young. They were 49 and 52, respectively. He had no friends. He was a very amateur, he was a deeply incompetent psychiatrist. And, basically he was a zero. And so his cousin says he basically went postal and kind of dressed it up in the garb of Islam so that he could be a hero in his own story. And I think that, so what I'm saying is, like, once you start looking, at the end of the day, probably a novelist would have done a better job of trying to understand this than I could have done. I mean, you think about Joseph Conrad and the secret agent and his portraits of the sort of hapless terrorists in London in the early 20th century. But I'm not a novelist, I'm a non-fiction writer. But the more you get into the why, which is after all the big question, the more complicated it gets. That goes back to the Immanuel Kant observation about from the crooked timber of humanity, not a straight thing is made. Because I've been on my book tour now for 2 weeks, and of course, the big question is why. Mm-hmm. Why do these people? And that was the big question I was trying to answer. And my wife is from Louisiana, so I'm going to use a Louisiana metaphor for a minute, which is it's kind of a gumbo with different ingredients. And when you make a gumbo, you can there's all sorts of different things you can put in and cook it a lot of different ways. And so it's usually a gumbo of some Islamist militant ideology, some personal disappointments, some desire for belonging, something bigger than yourself. Sometimes it's fun and exciting. But for each of the individuals I looked at, and most of them are males, it varies in what some are. I mean, David Coleman Headley, who planned the Mumbai attacks in 2008, and he's from Chicago. David Coleman Headley is a kind of classic sociopath or psychopath. He's a guy, he was a major drug dealer who then became an informant for the DEA, a supposedly observant Muslim who had multiple affairs and girlfriends and wives, a person who betrayed his own country by scoping out an American Jewish center in Mumbai for a certain attack, and 6 people died there. This is a guy who had only had two real jobs in his life. He worked in his mother's bar in Philly, and then he worked on the Upper West Side. He had a video store here. But otherwise, he was unemployed, and I think for him, it was basically fun. What he found, when you're a sociopath or a psychopath, and there are differences, I'm not a psychiatrist, but, you enjoy getting one over on people, and I think that was his principal motivation. So, and then you have others, I think Tom Durkin's client, Hamza Khan, the 19-year-old, is a true believer. They generally saw themselves, we know from the letters that they were writing, that they left behind for their parents. They saw that ISIS, they believe, was creating an Islamic utopia. These are very smart kids. Right? I mean, and so there is, you can make some general observations. You can say, here's the average of these 330 cases, but when you look into each case, it has its own particularities.
Okay, so that brings us to law enforcement. Because if every case is a case unto itself, and yet you're trying to create a policy that has a strategy for deterrence or disruption, I'm going to ask you, how do you assess, and you talk a lot about this in the book, where the lines of entrapment begin and end,
Yeah.
How fuzzy is the gray area. What is the challenge, the biggest challenge to law enforcement right now, and how are they doing in maneuvering through the space of, it's not a cookie cutter. It's not, the person has to do X to be...
I'm going to quote Andy Liebman. There's a film loosely adapted from the book called Homegrown, which is on HBO, and I think it's very well done. But Andy Liebman in the film essentially says, the Congress, the president, and the American people made it very clear to us that they weren't going to, the standard was no terrorism. I mean, that was the message that they were getting, So I think law enforcement is not acting sort of in a cavalier manner, I don't think. I mean, they've been signaled by the American public that there's zero tolerance for this. And by the way, if Abdul Mutallab, the underwear bomber, had succeeded on Christmas Day 2009, President Obama would have been a one-term president. I mean, it's that simple. And that's not a comment on him or Republicans or Democrats. I think 300 people dying in a plane accident right over Detroit, a lot more people on the ground, all of it covered live by CNN, Fox, every other network. I mean, just do the political math. And when I say in the book, and I think historians will say, that was probably one of the most important events of the Obama presidency, because this was the guy who was going to end the wars, who didn't want to be defined by terrorism, and he didn't. I mean, his national security policy there's a lot of continuity with the Bush administration. If you look, let me give you one data point to support that. Under President George W. Bush, there was one drone strike in Yemen. Under President Obama, there have been at least 120. I mean, I think it speaks for itself. And, you know, we think of President Obama, at least a lot of the Republican right thinks of him as A, a Muslim, and B, sort of feckless and hopeless. And, well, he's conducted more wars in Muslim countries than any American president, 7. Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, Somalia, Libya, I'm missing 1, but there are 7. And, you know, yeah, and you know, he's killed, if you even take the most conservative estimate of numbers, we collect this at New America where I work, he's killed at least 3,000 people in drone strikes. That's more than around 4 times the number that President George W. Bush sent to Guantanamo. You know, and you know, is it better to be sent to Guantanamo or better to die in a drone strike is an interesting question. That, so he's not as he's portrayed or how many people thought about him when they voted for him for the first time. But so law enforcement, you know, I obviously also when you write a book, you take certain emblematic cases, and one of the cases I take is this guy Matthew Laneza, who's actually just communicated with me from prison, and he's a schizophrenic, bipolar 26-year-old who was well known to the FBI to be schizophrenic and bipolar, who should be in a group home on medication. He was taking all sorts of medications. And the FBI he never had a friend. He was like he has the mind of an 8-year-old, basically. He barely can feed himself. And when I heard about the case, I thought, wow, because you want to present to the reader, you know, the unambiguous cases that make a certain point. And the FBI entrapped him, I think, by, you know, as Karen has long pointed out, you know, entrapment has never worked as a legal matter, as a defense. But we kind of know what it looks like when we see a schizophrenic, bipolar kid with no friends, with the mind of an 8-year-old who suddenly is sucked into something very exciting. And suddenly he's got a friend who's helping him. And he tells the friend, you know, well, if we do this thing, let's blow up the bomb at 4 o'clock in the morning where there'll be no casualties. And, you know, but the friend, of course, is an FBI undercover officer, and the plot is to blow up a bank in Oakland, and now he's in prison. He took a plea deal, which, you know, no lawyer worth his salt, I think, has come. We know the acquittal rate is 1% in these cases. So, I mean, you're going to trial, you're going to risk quite a lot. So he's taken a plea deal, and he's in prison for a long time. So I think that's an example of overkill. But the dilemma that law enforcement faces, and I call this chapter Pre-Crime, which was based on a Philip K. Dick novel that became the Steven Spielberg film Minority Report. I mean, there's a scene in the book where President George W. Bush, Bob Mueller comes in to meet Bush for the first time. It's about a week after 9/11, and Mueller comes out with a pretty detailed account of, you know, what happened at the Trade Center and the links to al-Qaeda and the case that they can develop. And Bush interrupts him and said, Bob, that's what the FBI has been doing for a century. I don't want to hear about this. I want you to stop the next 9/11. I don't want you to solve, I mean, obviously want you to solve it. So that was a very different directive, and the intelligence, you know, there was a debate in this country, should we have an MI5 like Britain, a domestic intelligence agency? Well, I think to a large degree the FBI has become more like a domestic intelligence agency. There is a vast analytical cadre that didn't exist before. There is, you know, thousands and thousands of informants that have been deployed, and they're acting like a domestic intelligence agency, obviously within the, you know, parameters of American law. And you know, so some of these cases, you know well that without an FBI informant, you know, they wouldn't be, you know, if they hadn't had the bad luck of encountering an FBI informant, you know, they wouldn't be in prison. But that said, you know, when San Bernardino happens, then the FBI or other law enforcement agencies get accused of missing things.
One of the things that you say in the book is that the United States in general, or the American public, or the American government, I'm not sure which one you mean, went down this rabbit hole of paranoia after 9/11.
Well, I mean, and I use that in the context of the Matthew Laneza case. And what happened with Matthew Laneza, the schizophrenic bipolar kid, he was at a party at his dad's house, and despite the fact he's Muslim, he had a drink, and suddenly his kind of schizophrenic, kind of bipolar kind of kicked in, and he starts having these hallucinations that helicopters are coming to get him, and the cops are called, and then they bring in the ambulance, and he's shouting Allah Akbar, and then that he gets sucked into, and I use then he goes down this rabbit hole of American paranoia. I mean, I don't think every case, but clearly this is a guy who's disturbed. And of course, disturbed people can be violent, but I don't think he had no history of violence.
Right. So there's a whole spectrum of cases, from the Abdul Muttalib, the underwear bomber over Detroit, to people like these younger individuals who are unstable, disturbed, maybe even schizophrenic. And so somehow they've all come under the same category, which I think is one of the good things that your book points out, which is that really there are a lot of different categories that we've put into one basket. One of the things, if I were writing a review of this book, I would have started like this. Here are the 10 assumptions we make about terrorism and counterterrorism in America that are somewhat set right by this book. Do you know what they are?
Well, I mean, the first one is Americans have got to use a British metaphor, have got their knickers in a huge collective twist about this subject, I think, because we have really, I mean, you're never going to hear, obviously it is a problem, but it's a low-level problem. I mean, if we had had this conversation in 2002 and we sort of did a poll of the room about how many, that over the next decade and a half, on average, 3 Americans a year would be killed in jihadi terrorist attacks, that would have seemed an absurdly optimistic kind of, I mean, we were worried about another 9/11, the anthrax attacks that happened. But the fact is that because of the work of many of the people in this room, and the defenses we have put up against that kind of attack, or anything close, are enormous. And we've created. Look, I mean, I'll give you an interesting data point. On 9/11, 1 out of the 10 richest counties in the United States was in the Washington, D.C. area. Does anybody have a guess about what the number is today? 7. Yeah, you had the right number. Okay, so there's been this massive Keynesian sort of just giant gusher of money that has landed on Washington that is largely devoted to this question. And wars tend to be good for Washington, and they are sort of Keynesian, whether it was World War II or Vietnam. I mean, and I'm not saying this in some sort of Noam Chomsky-like critique. I'm just making an observation. And so as a result of all that, on 9/11, there were 16 people on the no-fly list. Now there are 47,000. On 9/11, there was no TSA. There was no Department of Homeland Security. The FBI and the CIA barely talked to each other. The FBI was only told on August 25th that there were 2 members of al-Qaeda living in San Diego. And the CIA had known that for almost, since January. So all these things, and of course there's public, and then and I can give you a laundry list. I mean, the intelligence budget on 9/11 was $26 billion. Now it's $80 billion. And you don't hear any calls in the budget cuts for cutting counterterrorism. That is like the third rail. Even the Defense Department sort of having to, cut back. But you don't hear, and there was no National Counterterrorism Center on 9/11. I mean, the list goes on and on. But ultimately, and perhaps more importantly, there was no public knowledge this was a problem, because that is a huge force multiplier to everything else. So when Faisal Shahzad tried to blow up a bomb in Times Square on May 1st, 2010 at 6 p.m., he looked at video feeds about which corner at what time would you kill the most people. Well, a Saturday night at 6 p.m. in May, you're going to kill a lot of people. But it was a street vendor that said, hey, there's an SUV that's smoking, and alerted the cops. So public knowledge is a huge force multiplier to everything. So I mean, the real point of the book, and in fact, it's actually probably a terrible sales point for me, it's like, this is not really that big a problem. We've managed it. And in a political season, it's highly unlikely that anybody running for office is going to admit the obvious, which is we've done quite a good job of managing this and containing this. But that is the truth.
Was it 8% in Iowa of, the concerns, when they listed the concerns that they cared about when they were voting, terrorism was like 8%. So it's like, it's not big on the list of
well,
what's
no,
motivating.
actually, there's good data. I mean, this is, Republicans, 24% of Republicans polled in December, which was admittedly after San Bernardino said that the principal issue in the election is terrorism. 9% of Democrats. So, but, and I think the fact that Trump and Cruz have been doing well is somewhat related to these fears, because they have both produced some pretty simplistic ideas about how to deal with this, which is either carpet bomb Iraqi and Syrian cities or ban all Muslim immigration.
I want to ask a question that's a little far afield,
Yeah.
But it's related to something you said before, which is that about the drone policy and its relationship to terrorism trials and detention in general. Because we were talking about terrorism and homegrown terrorism and Obama and whether he's soft on terror, and you mentioned the drone strikes. But since we started these drone strikes under Obama. There are very few global detentions of terrorists, very few being brought into the American court system the way they used to be, none going to Guantanamo. And so what we're left with are these domestic terrorism cases, or they are hatched here, they're plotted here, the plans are here.
Yeah.
So how do you see the future of not just picking up potential domestic terrorists here and trying them, but do you think that the trials of terrorists outside the United States are really a thing of the past? There are very few al-Qaeda cases that have come into the system in the last 2.5 years. They're declining this year as well. So the question is, what do you think about trying foreign terrorists in the United States? Is that going to happen? Or do you think we're done with that?
I mean, I think they will happen on an occasional basis. But I mean,
Yeah.
the point of the book, Steve Cole, who was my former boss at New America and of course wrote Ghost Wars and is now the dean at Columbia Journalism School, said, you write a book and then you have to interpret it to other people, and there's two separate. And I think it's a very good point, because often you don't really even, when you write it, it's a different kind of. So some of the things I wrote, I wish I had the thoughts, and put them in the book. But the last time a foreign terrorist organization mounted a real plot in the United States was 6 years ago. It's Faisal Shahzad in Times Square. Now you could say Garland, Texas, kind of, there was some direct contact over Twitter between the two perpetrators who both got killed in Garland, Texas, and people in ISIS. So, well, I mean, certainly was ISIS inspired. Was it ISIS directed? They certainly had, I don't know. But the pack, so we're just not seeing the kinds of. It's going to be these homegrown cases. They're going to be Americans. The good news is their ability to do large-scale attacks is close to zero. The bad news is they're Americans, and they're ordinary Americans, and it's hard. Sometimes it can be hard to see them coming.
One of the things we haven't touched on, we sort of assumed it, and I think we better touch on it before questions, is what's inspiring these people that are inspired. Yeah. And I think you and I may take it for granted because we think about it all the time, but one of the points you talk about in the book is bin Ladenism, and what bin Ladenism is and how it's persisted. And can you talk a little bit about what's actually, in addition to personal strife or whatever it is, what's actually attracting these individuals to the ISIS message and how that ties to bin Laden?
Right, so we're a deeply ideological species, and we're always looking for an ideology that kind of we can attach our, not everybody, but it is part of our makeup to want to find something that explains an often complicated world. And so Marxism was one form of that, and Nazism was another, and bin Ladenism is another. And so what do ideologies do? Three things. They explain everything, they explain the past, and they also tell you what the future is going to be. So Nazism, it was going to be the 1,000-year Reich. They also have this commonality. There's always people in the way of getting to the utopia. So for Nazis, it was the Jews, the gypsies, homosexuals, and others, and the Poles and Slavic races. In the case of communism, it was counter-revolutionaries, the kulaks, and others, the people that Stalin killed. And in the case of bin Ladenism, the utopia is Taliban-style utopia from Indonesia to Morocco. The people standing in the way are the United States, Israel, the Jews, Arab regimes that don't rule like the Taliban. And so, bin Ladenism is one of the last revolutionary ideologies left standing. I mean, in the 70s, some of the kids who were attracted to this might have joined the Black Panthers or the Weather Underground or some other group. But Marxist ideologies are largely dead. I'm sure there are a couple of Marxist academics in Vermont somewhere. But as a general proposition, Marxism has sort of died as an idea. And it died with the Soviet Union. And this gets to the question of how long will this ideology be around? I think it will be longer. I mean, Marxist-Leninism actually lasted a very short time compared to most ideologies. Nazism even shorter. And of course, and by the way, I'm not making any criticism of religion here, because the secular political religions of Stalinism and Nazism created more human misery than any other creed that has preceded them. I'm just making the observation that we're an ideological species. Some people are seeking for meaning. Bin Ladenism seems to kind of have some answers. I think bin Laden articulated this ideology, he propagated it. And if you look at ISIS and al-Qaeda are in a dispute right now, but ISIS propaganda still reveres bin Laden. They see themselves as the rightful heirs of bin Laden. And so I think this ideology is going to be around for a while. I was discussing earlier, I thought the death of bin Laden and the Arab Spring would be kind of the death knell of all this, but of course it turned out to be, it's metastasized. It's worse. Clapper's statement yesterday, there are more terrorist safe havens now in the world than there were at any time in history, and I think that's true. What does that mean for the United States? Mostly it doesn't mean, it's, we're still, our defenses are pretty good. It's a big problem for the Middle East. I think we're in the beginning of a 30 to 50-year Sunni Shia regional civil war where all the parties, are going to just kind of keep fueling the conflict. And that's very bad news for the Middle East, and it's pretty bad news for Europe. But we're still protected by geography, and we're still protected by the fact that the Muslim American population overwhelmingly is not signing up for this ideology.
One of the things you point out has to do with the Muslim religion, with Islam, and thinking about the preventive strategy, thinking about the point of, particularly with conversion, it's about that point of wanting to join. In other words, if you're law enforcement, you're trying to figure out, what can I look at in all of this narrative of an individual's life? Can I look at somebody who's unstable in school? Where are we going to go down the Minority Report?
Well, the FBI, I came very late to something. Everybody's probably familiar with the MIPD radicalization report, and that looks at, it looks at a lot of cases, and the critique of it was that some of what the NYPD described was merely somebody becoming a fundamentalist, but the FBI, I think, has a much more, the FBI has I think, a very fruitful way of looking at this, and it comes out of, interestingly, this is something that began in Hollywood, which is the emerging discipline of threat management, and like a lot of American innovations, it began in California. And there's a guy called DeBecker who was basically, he had a bodyguard business for Hollywood stars. Now, Hollywood stars receive threats all the time. And of course, we know, a deranged Jodie Foster fan nearly killed Ronald Reagan. So these people can be quite dangerous. So the question is, who is dangerous and who is not dangerous? And so DeBecker assembled a database of some 5,000 threats, and he developed a system called Mosaic. Now, I learned all this very late in the reporting. I did not know it, but I got it into the book. And Mosaic was adopted by government agencies, including the U.S. Marshals. There was an historian, a guy called Ted Calhoun, who wrote the history of the U.S. Marshals. They've now been in existence for over 2 centuries. And he heard that the U.S. Marshals had a database of 3,000 threats against federal judges who they protect going back to 1980. So he started looking at these threats, and he found very interesting and counterintuitive. If you make a threat against a federal judge, you're almost certainly not going to go through with it. It's the people who don't make threats that will kill you. And so that actually saves a lot of time, because you're not getting a lot of false positives. So I'm getting to the point here. So there is now a much better understanding in the government about who is likely to be a problem. And the FBI, based on Ted Calhoun's work, has something called the pathway to violence. And they don't care if you're a neo-Nazi or an Islamic militant or just somebody who's a predator. And they look at, there are 6 stages: grievance, ideation, planning, preparation, getting the plan, assembling the plot, sort of breach, which often can be testing the system to see how you can get at the target, and finally attack. And this is and then there's something called inhibitors. Now, inhibitors, you can be going down the pathway to violence, but let's say you have a job, you're married, you have kids, and these would inhibit you. Let's say you have a divorce, you lose your house, you no longer see your kids, suddenly the things that were inhibiting you don't. And so this is a very fruitful way of looking very carefully. So the FBI is constantly, so the behavioral unit at FBI is, people from around the FBI field office around the country say, look, we've got this guy, he's posting on Facebook, he's got an ISIS flag, he seems to be radicalizing. Well, are there inhibitors in his life? Does he have a job? Is he married? Is he, so I think that is a pretty useful way of thinking about it. Now, of course, the big counterexample would be San Bernardino, in a sense, because they didn't have the inhibitors, but they did all the things that the pathway to violence. They did the planning, they did they were practicing at gun ranges, they had the grievance, they had the ideation. But anyway, that, I think ultimately that's going to be the way that you can't, as I've said earlier, until we have a machine that can read people's souls, which I don't think will ever happen, although I guess, big data about somebody and algorithms might get you there.
Well, along those lines, how has intervention so far worked? I mean, there have been...
Well, this is one of the big paradoxes. I mean, so, interventions that work are unrecorded often, I mean, because nothing happened. So I can give you some examples of interventions that didn't work. Shannon Conley, 19-year-old from Colorado, the FBI talked to her 4 times about...
Not work.
It did not work. They suggested, hey, don't join ISIS, join a humanitarian organization. She tried to get on a plane, she was arrested. Taimur Al-Insani, the people at his mosque talked to him and said, look, your behavior at the mosque, and he was kind of screaming and shouting at somebody because they were saying it was okay to celebrate Martin Luther King Day. The FBI also talked to Tamerlan about his potential links to militants. Now, most people who visit from the FBI would be, okay, whatever I'm doing, I'm just like, I'm not going to continue down that path. But for some people, it doesn't stop them. So interventions that succeed are, we know less about them. But I can give you examples of, the best kind of intervention is I profile Imam Majid, who's the leader of one of the largest mosques in the United States in Northern Virginia. And he's intervened in several cases of guys who are planning to join ISIS or thinking about it. And he intervenes in them and talks in he's a conservative Muslim cleric who can talk in theological terms about why this is a bad idea. And that, I think, is that's the best outcome, where there is no case, the person doesn't go down the path. And one final anecdote from the book, and this again gets to the complicated questions. Omar Hamami, who became a leader of Shabab from Daphne, Alabama, his best friend, Bernie Culverhouse, went all the way down the path to almost going to Somalia, radicalizing, starting to talk about jihad. Now, Bernie Culverhouse is working for a tech company in Silicon Valley, happily married, 3 kids. Why did Omar jump over the fence to this jihadization, and why did Bernie not go? And it was a very individual decision, even though they were exactly the same age. They both married sisters. They both had kids. They both married 2 Somali sisters. So for Bernie, his father had left him when he was a kid and abandoned the family, and he wasn't going to do that to his own children. And so that's what prevented him from going to Somalia. Omar Hamami, the fact that he had a kid, the fact that he was married, wasn't, he wanted to be part of the jihad. And I think for him it was exciting.
Yeah.
There was a romantic element to it.
Yeah. Okay, it's time for your questions. Wait for the mic. If you can, identify yourselves and make it as short as you can possibly make it, and make it a question. Is that good? All right.
By the way, just an observation. I find that, because I do quite a lot of these things, women ask questions, men make statements. Not always, but
there's a challenge for you. That's hilarious. All right, Bert. Don't forget our rules.
I'll try and make it a question.
Quick.
Bert Wise, a recovering lawyer from Washington.
Yeah.
I think the great takeaways from your book are you're disaggregating the diversity of these cases, and even within individuals, the mixture of motives or causes. But in terms of what to do about it, my question relates to your talk about the threat assessment in the Bureau. When there's something that's physical, buying something, practicing, that's one thing. When you start looking at what they're saying or characteristics, are you concerned, I haven't read your book, I've read a number of reviews, about the FBI under pressure from the government and the people going further and further upstream, especially if there's another San Bernardino, to try and figure out who might become a terrorist. When they had the FBI overdoing it in New York, there was testimony in the Senate by an FBI official that they thought they could identify people who possibly could become a potential threat. And I'm wondering if you're worried from your work about, especially if there's another event, going upstream and trying to find Muslims, in this case, who might become a terrorist. by excessive surveillance?
Yeah, I mean, look, I mean, there's certainly cases where, you know, the only, as far as I know, in federal terrorism cases, there's really only been like two, maybe four acquittals, and two of them were in the Liberty 7 case. And the Liberty 7 case was in Miami. You may recall it was a group of Haitian immigrants to the United States, and they had to say it was a half-baked plan to attack the Sears Tower in Chicago barely begins to cover it because they never even visited Chicago to case the building. And they were smoking a great deal of weed, and they believed in this obscure, I think they called themselves the Moorish Temple or something. I mean, anyway, they were obviously a bunch of deadbeats. And an informant was inserted in their midst, and it seemed that the main interest they had, and they were all sort of basically almost homeless, was to kind of get money out of the informant. And so it took, the trial went, they had to go to trial 3 times, and then eventually there were 2 of them were acquitted. Which is all by way of saying, yes, there is government overreach, I mean, no doubt. And then, you know, Karen and I were discussing the James Cromedy case, which was the so-called Newburgh 4. The informant offered them $250,000, a BMW, a holiday in the Caribbean. These were a bunch of basically homeless people as well. And the judge at the sentencing taught, the main guy was James Cromedy, and she had a wonderful line, which is, James Cromedy, that his buffoonery was positively Shakespearean. I mean, she said, like, you know, that this guy, you know, he was hopeless. But, you know, she had sentencing guidelines, and, you know, she sentenced him to 25 years. So, yes, of course there are these cases of overreach. Yeah.
Surveillance, like in New York, of the entire...
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, I think that, you know, that, of course, the case was settled, and the NYPD had to pay $2 million, and I guess my guess is it's largely event-driven. You know, if there was a big terrorist attack, I think, you know, I think the pendulum is slightly swinging back towards the liberty from the security, and I'll give you 2 pieces of evidence. One, Bill de Blasio closed down the unit at NYPD, that was the demographics unit. And 2, you know, the Congress and the President have agreed that your phone data will not be held without a warrant for 5 years. It will be held by the phone companies for a shorter period of time, and they need a warrant to get into your phone data. So for the moment...
Also precipitated by something in New York. Just saying, the Second Circuit decision.
Oh,
Just
yeah,
saying.
and of course precipitated by Edward Snowden, really.
Yeah,
I mean, at the end of the day.
But my point is that New York, which was attacked on 9/11,
Yeah.
is the place that is starting to make, you're talking about the pendulum swing?
Yeah.
It's interesting that here is where it's been very strong, and that's just putting that up there.
But I think, going to your question,
New York.
Sarah, I mean, I think there are a lot of cases, I mean, where we're seeing, you know, people kind of going upstream through sort of digital connections to see who's saying what, and are they really a threat? I mean, I think we're seeing that in these cases. But, you know, I think, you know, as a general proposition, being a radical in this country is not a crime. Being, you know, so, and this is the big dilemma for law enforcement. It's like, where does a radical become a militant who might do violence? And, you know, that is not an easy question to answer.
And we haven't figured out yet, and there's a lot of energy in the government to try to figure this out, both with how we're going to deal with internet and, for example, Twitter this week.
By the way, I quote George Pirro in the book, who's this special agent in charge in Miami, and he was the interrogator for Saddam Hussein. And one of the things that he said I thought was very interesting. A number of things he said was interesting. First of all, you know, the good old days, you know, there was a meeting at a mosque, or there was somebody who was a jihadi leader that you came and he had a kind of following, and, you know, none of that is true now. It's, you know, people radicalizing at home. But the other thing he said, like the window between sort of somebody radicalizing and, you know, maybe trying to do an act has now become much, much shorter.
Well, you know, the research that's been done in London on this, which, you know, they have these categories, sympathy to empathy to action, and when they tell you the time frame of how fast this goes now, if their research is correct, is
how fast is it?
Like it's a week and a half, you know,
wow.
like fast. That's what they'd say is the fastest, but it's kind of hard to believe, which is why I say if it's believable, but it's happening at a much greater pace than when they first started to track it. So I don't know if I believe that, actually.
You know, people fall in love over the internet, and in fact, when I'm now 53, but I talk to my colleagues who are in their 20s, I mean, they're meeting the person they fall in love with online, right, as a routine matter, which they're not, and so this, if you can fall in love with somebody online, you can also fall in love with a sort of violent ideology online. And one final point on that, because I want to quote the Israeli counterterrorism academic Gabriel Wyman, because we talk about lone wolves, and he has a very good formulation. You know, they're not lone wolves; they're part of a virtual pack, because there's like hundreds of people all sharing their same views, and you know, sometimes they'll be online for thousands of hours, and you're in a sort of virtual echo chamber of people who share your views.
Yeah, also, I want to say, if you look at these cases, I'm not sure the lone wolf would even hold up, because they actually have some interaction, some personal interaction. Sometimes it's with the FBI, but, you know, with other human beings in a way that I think we miss in telling
Right, well,
the story.
so like the Garland, Texas is an interesting example of sort of a blended, it was inspired by ISIS, but they were in touch directly with, and in the Hamza Khan case, they were inspired by ISIS, but they were also directly in touch with people in ISIS.
Yeah,
So what is that?
yeah, I don't know, but I think we have to rethink our language at some point.
Actually, there's a kind of linguistic point. I mean, I think at the core of so much of what he discussed and so much of the work that Karen has done and the center has done is we still don't have the language to really describe all this. And if we don't have the language, maybe we don't have the right formulation in our heads, because we're still caught in this is not just a law enforcement exercise. And yet this is not just this is not a form of war in any sense. And that's how we got ourselves in this huge pretzel that was trying to unwind in Guantanamo. But it's true with the drone policy, and it's so many, we're in a new form of warfare that isn't anything like anything that we have seen in the last several centuries, and maybe more equivalent to the Middle Ages in terms of the use of contractors and private militaries and groups that don't have attachment to states. And yeah, but we're still, I think part of the problem, 15 years after 9/11, we still literally don't have the language to kind of describe this properly.
No, I think that's right. I mean, Director of the FBI, Jim Comey, went to Congress last week, and he said that that this is not aspirational and it's not operational. It's something in between. Well, you know, I mean, you know, acknowledging the fact that we don't have a conceptual way to describe this, and I think that's
and that's why, you know, my book is not. I mean, I'm tough, I think, in some places on law enforcement, but I'm also aware of the dilemmas. You know, the Homegrown film I mentioned, which is really an excellent film by Greg Barker. The FBI, you know, some of these kids, yes, they're kids, and yes, they're doing casing videos, and yes, they're in touch with people in other organizations. That can be indicators that they are going to do something violent, or maybe it's just they're just being stupid, and law enforcement can't take the risk.
More questions, Joshua, and you.
I haven't read the book yet, but you know, I've read about it.
Josh, you've lived it.
And the concentration today has been on the people themselves changing, or what about things that change on the outside, such as policies, politics? In other words, that if there had been no Syria, would there have been so many people going to ISIS? So the question is, if you can eliminate that, which is not their responsibility, but our responsibility or government's responsibility. So how did you find that those were factors that could change people's, you know, in terms of inhibitors, motivators?
Well, yeah, I mean, we all live. I mean, we all live in the history that we live in. I mean, I think if there were, you know, Assad is, you know, he's the perfect villain in a sense. If you're a Sunni fundamentalist, I mean, he's inflicting a tremendously totalitarian war on his Sunni population. He's an al-Awlaki, which is a heretical form of Shiism. He's also a secular dictator, which makes him an apostate, which is the gravest crime in Islam. So, you know, if I was a Sunni fundamentalist, you know, I would also be. I mean, and clearly, you know, just out of humanitarian issues, you think that what Assad is doing is appalling. So, yeah, if you do the thought experiment where Syria hadn't happened, there wouldn't be ISIS and there wouldn't be these cases. But there is always the jihad de jour, which is very interesting. So I'll give you a concrete example of that. If you look at San Bernardino, you know, he was flirting with al-Qaeda in Yemen before, you know, they were flirting with ISIS, because that was the jihad de jour. And before al-Qaeda in Yemen, there was al-Shabaab, which is getting, now is not an attractive jihad because Shabab basically has been defeated there. So, I mean, I think there's always a jihad du jour. We live in the history, we're creatures of the history we live in. So yes, without Syria, there wouldn't be so many cases. But if if you go back in time, without our invasion of Iraq, there wouldn't be ISIS, because Abu Musab al-Zarqawi didn't go to Iraq until we invaded. And he, of course, founded the parent organization of al-Qaeda. So obviously, we've created some of this history ourselves unintentionally, but it's still, we're implicated in it.
Over here in the back. Wait for the microphone.
What's the topic of your next book?
Well, that is a really good question, one I can't raise with my wife, because books, they take up every, they fill every nook and cranny of your life, and weekends and vacations sort of have to take a second seat. But I'm interested in two different ideas. They're sort of related. I feel like there still hasn't been a very good full biography of bin Laden, strangely. Because at the end of the day, this is his idea. And
this is one of those things where it's the most obvious thing for you to write in the whole world. It's like, of course.
And I don't know if you're familiar with Ian Kershaw's books on the Nazis, and to do a biography of bin Laden that also tells the wider story, but to do it through his narrative. Larry Wright, who's well known to the center, and he gave, I think, the most brilliant talk I have ever heard about how to write long-form nonfiction. And one of the things that he looks for is what he calls a donkey. And when he's doing a story, the donkey is the person who she or she may not be the main character, but he or she is going to carry a lot of the weight of the story to kind of keep you going through in the narrative. So if you think about Looming Tower, who were the donkeys? One was John O'Neill. He was one of that told the whole FBI story, but through this one character. And the other one was Ayman al-Zawahiri, who was the number 2 in al-Qaeda. So anyway, you asked me the question. I would like to, because the other idea I had was, a book called A 30-Year War. We've been in a 30-year war with al-Qaeda and its children. We didn't know it. I mean, al-Qaeda was founded in 1988, and so some combination of those two things is what I'd like to do next. Now,
Just be careful where you start those 30 years, because for the American judicial system, this is like a big deal, and for Guantanamo, were we at war, when we were at war, how are we going to find, when we can have military commissions. So just wait till we're all done with that and then write that book, so that we can, don't do that now. Yeah, right here in the front row. Wait for the microphone, please. Oh, yeah, Phil, sure.
How effective was al-Awlaki as a propagandist, and what influence did he have on this?
Al-Awlaki, the American cleric who became one of the operational leaders of al-Qaeda in Yemen, he's hugely effective. In our database of 330 cases, we found his, and he's still effective after his death. I mean, killing him did not kill his ideas, and so his speeches, his lectures show up in many of these cases. So does Inspire magazine, which he had a help in editing. And the fact that he spoke colloquial English, made him hugely influential in the English-speaking jihadi. There was a British MP called Stephen Timms who was narrowly escaped being murdered, was severely wounded by a woman called Rosh Hashanah. I can't remember her last name, but she listened to about 100 hours of al-Awlaki, going to your question of sympathy to empathy to action, over the course of about a week, and decided to kill this guy, Stephen Timms, who had voted in favor of the Iraq War. So, he's been influential not just in the United States, but anywhere in the English-speaking world. And, President Obama, by the account of people that I spoke to who know him well, said did not have a second thought about ordering effectively his execution, which is the first time. It goes back to this question of Obama as a commander-in-chief. It's the first time since the Civil War that a president has ordered the death of an American citizen, the assassination, essentially. And because of, President Obama thought that, Anwar al-Awlaki was a very grave danger. They saw him as more dangerous than Ayman al-Zawahiri after bin Laden's death. And he didn't, the constitutional law professor from Chicago he was very comfortable with the decision to kill al-Awlaki.
Interesting, because al-Awlaki is very much the link between al-Qaeda and ISIS, sort of the ideology of al-Qaeda, but the methods that ISIS take up. And you can see in some of these criminal complaints a fear about another al-Awlaki emerging. And that's part of this focus on the internet, not just as predictor, but as harm, the harm that can be caused through incenting.
By the way, there might be something worse than ISIS coming down the pike. I mean, history has a way of surprising us, but let's do the thought experiment where al-Qaeda and ISIS got back together.
Yeah, yeah.
There's no reason why that shouldn't happen. I mean, right now, Freud has a marvelous expression of the narcissism of minor differences, and I think much of life can be explained by that, but al-Qaeda's differences with ISIS are not that big at the end of the day, and it's more about personalities at the top. And if these groups got together, I mean, that would be a problem.
Yep, yep. And you see, there have been some rumblings of a certain kind of connection if you're reading the foreign news.
By the way, another thing, when the new president comes into office on January 20th, 2017, I hope he or she doesn't wind down our presence in Afghanistan as per the Obama plan, because we've already seen how this unfolds in Iraq. And I saw an estimate today that there are somewhere between 1,000 and 3,000 ISIS fighters in Afghanistan already. They're basically people who've put on the ISIS patch that were previously Taliban. But, there's no reason for us to make the same set of mistakes we've already made.
That will be next year when we bring you back and say, what are we going to do? Phil?
Hi, Peter. It's my 5th Peter Bergen book, by the way. Should be read in tandem. Karen's very modest, but she has a book coming out called Rogue Justice, which
is going to be huge, and it's going to be published
should be read
May
in
24th.
tandem with Peter's book. They really complement each other. I'm not going to make a speech. Let me try to ask 2 questions. Not too long ago, FBI Director Jim Comey, I think, was standing right there at a podium, and he told this center that there were FBI investigations of ISIS in all 50 states. He later said, or others said, there were 900 active investigations. I want to see if you could comment more on this sort of carryover of the way we handle the al-Qaeda cases or the al-Qaeda wannabe cases after 9/11, the question of intervention versus prosecution, and whether you think, given that law enforcement is monitoring so much activity that these mostly young people are doing, if the scales might tip back toward talking to the imam in the example you gave, or saying, don't get on the plane, rather than just continuing with the sting and making a case.
Yeah.
And lastly, on that, the counter-programming, which the State Department and Homeland Security are really talking a lot about, whether you think that can really be effective combating ISIS on social media. We just did a story on that at the PBS NewsHour, where I'm now working, or whether you think that's just a big game of whack-a-mole that can't work.
Sort of counter narratives by the U.S. government about, well, I mean, on the first one, I've talked to people at the White House, very serious people who, at the end of the day, the FBI is working as an arm of the Justice Department, and the Justice Department is working at the behest of what the White House is sort of directing policy-wise. So there has to be a policy shift, not at FBI, or even at DOJ. The White House has to sort of say, look, we need a different approach. And I think the approach, as you indicate, Phil, is, I think in cases like the Khan case, where there was no allegation of violence by any of the 3 kids, the government never alleged they were planning acts of violence. I mean, for a 19-year-old to face a 15-year sentence for basically something akin to a thought crime, I think the sentences are just way out of whack. And so there should be off-ramps where a kid is told, we're going to give you a 2 or 3 year sentence and supervised probation, but not these kind of, something that, or there should be there should be an intervention where they say, look, we know you're thinking these things, and we're warning you. Now, that doesn't always work. Shannon Connolly was visited by the FBI 4 times, and it didn't work with her, but it might work with some people. And obviously, the best outcome is if you can get an imam to intervene. One of the things I found in the book, which was really interesting, again, I found it late in the day, the FBI has done a study of 80 terrorism cases, and they found who is likely to know the most about a case and who is most likely to say anything to the government. And peers know the most, but are the least likely to say anything. Think about the San Bernardino friend who had gave them the rifles. Family members know them next most. They are less likely, they're more likely than peers to say anything, but they still. Then authority figures, clerics, bosses, they know they can sometimes see something. they're relatively likely to inform. And the people at the bottom who know the least, but are the most likely to say something, are strangers, which raises a big question for the See Something, Say Something campaign, because basically it's a lot of false positives. I saw a Middle Eastern guy photographing a bridge. Well, 99 times out of 100, that's just a Middle Eastern guy photographing a bridge. But that's all by way of saying the people who actually can do something are, at the end of the day, people who know the individual. The Hamza, I think the Khan family, and Tom, you can correct me if I'm wrong, I mean, they feel that if the FBI had told them that their kids were going down this path, that they would have said something to the kids to stop them.
Last question from a student.
Thanks. Matt Greer, just a student here. I'm curious, so that given that these ISIS cases are being processed through the criminal justice, or the civilian courts as opposed to military courts, and that a lot of these sentences are not life sentences, these people will be back out on the streets at a certain point. Are there de-radicalization programs in prisons? I know that like Saudi Arabia has this terrorist rehab. I don't know any of the details of it. I imagine something like that would run into problems in this country. But are there programs in prisons that are targeted towards getting people with these ideas to shift away from them?
I don't think so. I mean, there was a big concern in this country about prison radicalization, and I think we look at all of the cases, it really was overblown. There were very few cases of people who kind of radicalized in prison. And you mentioned the Saudi example. I mean, they had a domestic insurgency more than it was not just a terrorist problem. They had thousands of people who were part of these groups, and they needed a de-radicalization program. And they, of course, they're experts on Wahhabi Islam, and we are not. We, the United States. So I mean, the government can't really. U.S. government is not really equipped to do it. So I don't think I don't see the huge need for it necessarily, because we just don't have this, and also we're not. I don't think the government is really well equipped to do this. And I do think the American Muslim community is doing some thinking about this issue. And at the end of the day, the solution will have to come from them rather than anybody else, because the U.S. government has a kiss of death problem. It has a lack of knowledge problem. And you asked Phil about how these counter narratives are working. I mean, I don't think they'll ever work from the U.S. government. And at the end of the day, this whole idea of counter radicalization, I think, is basically a total waste of time for the following reason. Countering radicalization is like turning the tide back. I mean, it's so nebulous and such a big task. What we want to do is we want to stop people being recruited by these groups, and we want to stop individual recruitments. And that's a much more doable task, whether it's an imam talking somebody out of something, or whether it's an FBI, or whether it's an indictment, or somebody stopping somebody at an airport. I mean, that's what we want to stop. Because at the end of the day, this is about American national security. Trying to stop radicalization around the world is a fool's errand. It's just too big a task, and we're just never going to achieve it. We just what we need to stop is the recruitment of these people to these groups. And probably the most effective way to do that is basically defectors. I mean, there was a great piece in the New York Times a few months back about 2 women who defected from the group at great personal risk. But I mean, the picture they painted of what it's really like in the so-called ISIS utopia, I mean, was pretty grim.
Well, Peter, I want to leave time for signing your book. Let me just say a few things. First of all, you're going to love reading this book, and I'm not kidding you. And the reason is that unlike so much of the written matter in this field, it's actually about human beings. It's about people. It's about the people who struggled with being teenagers and young adults in the United States and went down a path that did no good for anybody. And it's about the people who had to think about this in this country and the challenges they've encountered. And so I think it's like for the first time that we can really look at this issue and think about it as not a problem of the internet and not the problem of some kind of ideology that's wafting through the air, but actually about individuals on all sides and how they're grappling with it. So whatever book Peter wrote, I would have loved, because I think he's a gem. But I can't wait for the next one on bin Laden. That's awesome. So thank you so much, and join me in thanking Peter. Oh, and